Good morning, BookTube. Well, thank you so much to all of the new subscribers. I keep seeing your names pop up and I'm a little bit shocked. Very much flattered. Thank you for considering following this particular channel. I apologize for the radio silence this last month. Folks who have been following me since the beginning of the year know that January and February were pretty much thrown apart by the fact that there was a familial crisis, not my family, somebody else's family, that landed in my lap. Medical crisis, housing crisis for a family in the community. And after addressing that, March became a month of scramble to try to catch up on lots of projects, which also meant going through a lot of emotions around those projects, as we're going to talk about with this latest work, which is coming out March 4th. But first, I need a huge shout out to Elaine. Thank you so much, Elaine, for bringing this beautiful baby into my life. This new microphone actually is read by my laptop as a microphone. Impressive. The last microphone that I was using, the laptop could not register it as an external device, so it's as if I had nothing in front of me. I had no technology helping, but hopefully now we'll finally have dealt with the echo, because this microphone is phenomenal. So my heart goes out, my thanks go out to Elaine for providing me with this and some other wonderful equipment. I still have to try to adjust the, there's a lovely little webcam as well, but right now there's something about the operating speed that's making it a little bit difficult for me to hook into my workflow, but I'll get there. So one thing at a time, clear voice, that's the most important part. So now we've got a new month and we are in the process of prepping for the release of Children of Doro. And again, I was scrambling in March to try to get the revisions done, but I also, a part of me, I just don't like scramble. So the revisions are taking the time they need to take because I want it to be absolutely perfect for you folks. This is the book that I have poured my philosophy into. So in January, I published a piece that tested humanism against one of the worst possible periods in history. Not the worst, there are many terrible periods in human history, but Then Raise the Dead Man High was set in the Soviet Union. It was set in the 1920s through 1940s with the Coda in the 1950s, specifically to test out humanist philosophy among our worst instincts when we are oppressed by things outside of us, and an internal oppression, which was much more important to think about. And that was a very important piece for me to write. I wrote it to save my own life more than anything. I had gone for most of my life through really painful down cycles as somebody with bipolar 2. And when I say painful down cycles, I mean physically painful. There was a long period of my life when I thought I would die in a down cycle and I couldn't control it, simply because the chronic pain that one lives with and can live with in a bipolar 2 down cycle is pretty intense. Now, maybe some other time I'll talk about the way that I have moved out of that. Dietary changes made a huge difference in improving mental health. But for the majority of my time in Canada, it was medication, heavy medication. I used to joke about them being like horse tranquilizers to try to get me to a calm state so that I would not do anything truly terrible during the extreme pain that I felt. And so I'm describing this to describe the kind of oscillating struggle that I lived with when I first imagined Then Raise the Dead Man High. And I truly felt that there was a sort of logical reason for truly giving up. When you live with that much pain, and you're also somebody who's a fairly cerebral person, you come up with lots of rationalizations because the world is a very difficult place. And that's a prison that I lived within for a long time. And the hardest part too with medication, a lot of medications, especially for bipolar, all they do is they dull everything to the point that you can't function much at all. And so there was no room for creative practice as well. It's quite painful. All of that pain, all that suffering went into Then Raise the Dead Man High. But Children of Doro is different. Children of Doro is my proactive humanist text. So between the two of them, I feel like I have said everything I really need to say, which is a difficult place to be in, and I'll talk about that in a second too. But Children of Doro is where I played out the struggle to be good, I guess, in a universe in which we constantly do harm to one another, and in doing harm to one another, do harm to ourselves. And this book has many inspirations, which I'm going to talk about over the course of these next, I think probably about 6 videos, and I look forward to talking about quite a few of them. But the most important one has to be discussed up front. I already talked about this in my newsletter, which if you're not following, I highly recommend, mlclark.substack.com, weekly analysis, media sometimes, talking a little bit about writing process and certainly about publishing. We'll also talk a little bit about publishing and what I've learned as an indie publisher in one of the upcoming videos here. But I just need to get back on track, get back in the saddle, and start producing these again. So all in good time. The most important influence for this novel is Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov happens to be my favorite novel, as I discussed in that newsletter. And yet it's a very interesting novel to have as one's favorite, because it's not that I disagree with elements of it, but I recognize that Dostoevsky was writing it within a context, and that context doesn't fully serve me. So some of you are like, oh, who? So let me explain a little bit. Dostoevsky's novel was written in the 19th century, late 19th century, and since then it has been extremely influential for a variety of writers. We'll talk about that in one of these other pieces. I will talk about some of the influences in science fiction, which are great because I'm not the first person to be taking Russian literature and applying it to a science fiction context. But when he wrote this was his last novel, and he too tried to pour in everything he had learned from life. And there are a lot of different ways to read the piece, but that is part of what makes it so special. Now, in the 19th century, you had quite a few more works were written in third-person narration, and truly omniscient third-person narration. Some of you may not be writers or familiar with that terminology, but a lot of the work that you read today is first-person, and it's first-person to an extreme extent. If it's not first-person, it's third-person limited, in which you have a kind of omniscient third-person narration. ML did this, Liliana did that, but always with a side. It takes a particular point of view, and it sticks more or less to that point of view. And that is a fairly recent partiality in Western publishing. Most other publishing contexts can still allow for a lot of fluidity, but truly quite a few editors will consider it inconsistent if you start with one particular voice, and within a chapter maybe move to the narrator giving insight into the mental state of another character. While you're in that chapter, you're supposed to be stuck in that point of view. That's a very rigid, very Western, and very recent phenomenon, but it wasn't always that way. And so in the 19th century, you had quite a bit of social realist literature that focused on describing a context in total. And to do that, one had to move through many different character positions. One had to think about life as a community of different perspectives. And so, in general, you have third-person narration in the 19th century to a greater extent than we have today, huge character lists. And I should also mention, a lot of people, they look at these giant tomes from another era and they think, oh my goodness, who had time to read all that? One thing we often forget is that publishing a book as a complete book is itself a fairly new phenomenon. What happened in the 19th century was serialization. So what would happen is somebody would buy a copy of a journal, and you'd have a few chapters in that issue, or maybe as a newspaper of the week, and you'd take it home and you'd read it out loud to some of your family, you'd laugh at some of the components. It was a much more communal activity, which again was reflected in the narration. So we lost a lot of that. We lost a lot of that culture. We do have a little bit of that collaborative culture present with, thanks to the internet, short stories that are available free to read, so we can all read the same story and we can talk about it to a greater extent than we have been able to for a few decades. But generally speaking, our literary scene is much less collaborative, much less constructive. Like, now imagine some of these great works, the famous works that we look at as these tomes today, they were written in installments in newspapers, which meant that the author could receive feedback while they were still writing the piece. You saw this most famously in, when I say famously, I'm talking as a literary scholar, so maybe not famously to you, but George Eliot, Middlemarch, quite famously starts in an extremely interior mode, and we follow a lot of the internal lives of characters, but there were complaints from readers. We need more action. And by the end of it, you have a murder, you have a mystery, you've got a lot of other components thrown in. So the way that work was done, the way that literature was shared was actually a conversation. We don't have that as much today. I wish we did, but there is far too much about promotion, about blasting this book, support this author, buy this book, end of story. Or maybe recommend it for your book club, and then they can talk about it. But just the lack of ability to sit with content is a little disheartening in some ways. There's a lot of terrific content out there, although that's itself part of the problem. We have so much. Every day I am seeing a new list of wonderful new books, indie published or traditionally published, and you have these adorable articles, 12 books you must read in April. 12 books? New books on top of everything else that nobody had a chance to finish in March. It's just not going to happen. So we have to choose our discourses. We have to choose our conversations well. And so I chose for this particular piece to be in conversation with the dead, which is something that a lot of writers do too. So back to Dostoevsky. He was absolutely writing third-person narration to an extent, in the sense that there are many different characters here, but his narrator is special. And I mean it. If you look this up, on Wiki, you're going to see this style, this point of view is pretty much his. There's almost nobody else who has been able to pull this off. It's called polyphonic narration. Polyphonic narration. You can hear in that name multiple voices, right? So the funny thing about his narrator is that technically it feels a little bit like it should be third-person omniscient, and that omniscience has a perspective, a voice, it has its loyalties, its partialities, but it is an omniscient presence that just floats around everywhere. Except that it doesn't. It is both privy to a lot of conversations that it shouldn't be, and a lot of internal thoughts that it shouldn't be, while also being an actual character in the book as well. The narrator is identified as someone who's in a trial that happens later on. They're in the gallery, they're part of the audience watching. So Dostoevsky is very murky in this regard, but it makes perfect sense for him because his work tends to trade in a little bit of madness, and we'll get into that in a second. But it's very special. And I mentioned this before I even talk about what the book is about, because I want more than anything for people to understand that the thrust of this work is not about having one definitive outcome. It's about representing a multiplicity of points of view and holding those views in tension, even when the tension is extremely difficult. And this is rare, especially for work in the Western context right now. You want an ally in the text. You want to know who you're supposed to be following, who you're supposed to be supporting, who is right. And it's either the protagonist, usually it's the protagonist, and you have a sense of righteousness with them all throughout, or you have a vague sense that the protagonist is struggling to understand or acknowledge another point of view in the text, and then they're going to discover it over the course of the text. And this reflects so much of our very individualist context right now, is that we don't do well with holding a multiplicity of views in tension. I wish we did. And that's why I decided that I would be in conversation with this work. So what is this work? Oh, there are so many ways to broach this piece. At its core, it's a murder mystery. Dostoevsky wrote a murder mystery, right? There is a family. It is a family drama about 4 brothers, 3 quote-unquote legitimate, 1 bastard, and their father. And their father is a tyrant. He is an angry, petty, manipulative man. He has caused so much hurt to his family and to others around him. And each of these children of Karamazov, the Brothers Karamazov themselves, embodies a very different approach to moving through the world. We have Ivan, who is the intellect. And when I say he is the intellect, that doesn't necessarily mean that gives him any peace. In fact, that's part of his struggle through this piece, is that he can argue for any position, including quite a few shocking positions, especially with respect to religion in the text, which is huge. The idea of we have the Catholic Orthodox Church, and I say both because the Russian Church does consider itself to be Catholic too. It follows the Creed, and it has a very strong tension. The most important part, I want to simplify this as much as I can, is that there is church, and there's an institution as well as faith. Those are really important tensions that are held up in many parts of this book, because the church as an institution is one of many cultural institutions that are challenged and questioned throughout this text as something that can provide any kind of justice, any kind of stability, any kind of salvation. So I don't want to get, in this episode, we'll go into deeper components, but I really want us to think thematically about individual struggle, the idea of a doctrine provided by a church or an institution or structure of faith, and then there are also some interesting secular components, especially with in relation to crime, the judicial system, that come up later. And those are some huge tensions that are being played out in many different ways by the characters. So Ivan, intellectual that he can argue for and against some quite provocative positions. He doesn't necessarily believe them, but he definitely believes in and is enamored by the power of debate. And so this is going to lead to his character arc over the course of the piece. We also have Dmitri. Dmitri is a man who lives by his passions, his heart, his impulse, maybe another organ as well. He is constantly moved by the heart, the humanity, the body, in a way that the other brothers are not. He is, in that way, a little bit more sincere, even when he screws people over all the time, and when he constantly finds himself in a position of need to beg and ask, and to be much like his father in some ways, to rage a lot like his father. He is at the same time quite sincere and open. He's living in the moment, following the pulse of his feelings and his impulses in any given moment. So he embodies just the brashest side of humanity. And then you have Alyosha. And Alyosha was really important to Dostoevsky. Alyosha is named after his son who died of epilepsy 2 years before the publication of this piece. So epilepsy at that time was a very difficult illness. It could easily lead to convulsions and secondary consequences up to death. Today, epilepsy is definitely treated a lot better. I say this because someone with bipolar and epilepsy have similar treatment pathways. So a lot of what works for epileptic patients also works for bipolar patients. So near and dear to my heart, this other frustrating affliction. And so Alyosha, it's interesting because when you read the prologue of Brothers Karamazov, you get a sense that Dostoevsky didn't actually intend for Brothers Karamazov to be just the one volume. There is a hint that he meant to write more adventures of Alyosha after. He never got a chance to. And I don't think he needed to, and so it ends up being part of the mythos of this novel, that so much is built into it that could extend outward beyond that particular text. But Alyosha, dear sweet boy, man in this piece, is trying to pursue a good life, a moral life, a life of the spirit in harmony with the world. And he does this by taking on a good mentor. He takes on Brother Zosima, is the greatest monk in that particular time. There's a man in this monastery who is adored by everyone. He's considered to be the wisest person, and he'll have a solution to all your problems. And that's quite a bit of veneration. And this is, again, when I talk about the institutions and the idea of faith and how Dostoevsky is navigating it throughout this piece, he's reflecting also on the way that we set up these figures and how fickle we are about putting people up on pedestals and then taking them down, because in a very human way, this person loses their pedestal status, quite arbitrary and fickle. But the most important part is that Alyosha is trying to move through the world in a way that can atone for sins of his family, the harm that's been done to others around him, and to try to figure out how to live a good life. His brothers love to lecture at him because he is a little bit different in that way, and he himself listens to and receives and is trying to move to a place where he can figure out how best to live. And again, it's a lot is held in tension. So I'm trying not to reduce this novel. I'm trying to keep it to these abstracts. But we've got this life of the mind, life of the heart, we've got life of the spirit, and then we have Smerdyakov. And Smerdyakov is the bastard son. He has epilepsy. And he is miserable. And he represents the inclination in all of us toward nihilism at times. And he is easily affected by his circumstances because he has been dealt a very rough hand. He works as a servant for his father because he doesn't get to be a real son. And his mother was absolutely somebody who was abused. All the mothers were pretty much abused by the father in this particular text. But his mother more than ever, more than any. And she had a different way of moving through the world, a simpler way of moving through the world. And a lot of tragedy came into being because of this family. So Smerdyakov carries that within him. He carries all of that absurdity. He carries all of that sense of bleakness and cynicism. And he's sarcastic and yet justified in many ways for his sarcasm and for his cynicism. So we have these four brothers. And the first half of the book is building up to the death of the father. So it holds us in tension. Dostoevsky moves us through different ways of seeing the world. And that's the polyphonic narration before we get to the death, which we know is going to happen. Karamazov is going to die. And he does. And then the rest of the book has to do with the question of who killed him. Who killed the father? Which part of the human condition represented in his four children killed them? And spoilers are silly when it comes to work like this. I think it's pretty obvious which of the four is going to be the one who's actually done the deed. But the important part of this work is that Dostoevsky leaves room for complicity for all four. And that's really important. One of them, Dmitri, ends up getting arrested for the crime because he's the impulsive, impassioned one. He's the one who's aggrieved. He's the one who had arguments over finances and romance with his father. They're both vying for the same woman at one particular point. And so the second half of the book not only explores the consequences of a lot of what was set up in the first half, but also looks into a lot of secular notions of justice and highlights the sheer fickleness of the crowd. And that's also why it's such an interesting book to return to pretty much 150 years later, because especially in those trial scenes, we have a mob that goes in wanting Dmitri to just hang for these offenses because obviously he's guilty. And Dmitri makes an impassioned speech in the middle of the trial that changes the crowd, the mood of the crowd, but it doesn't change the course of quote-unquote justice. And that's an interesting, striking observation for Dostoevsky to make long before Twitter, long before social media, but human beings haven't really changed that much. We all have that kind of very snap judgment approach to major, serious, grave issues of morality and ethics, and in any era we will find an outlet for not just the pursuit of justice, but the pursuit of virtue signaling around justice. So there's a lot in this piece, so much. I don't want to get into everything in this episode. We'll get into some more, but I'm also going to talk about some other influences in the next few episodes. The next episode, for instance, we'll talk about the sci-fi component. But for now, I just wanted to say that writing this book was extremely important for me because I use this framework from Dostoevsky to ask similar questions. And the reason it's different, besides the fact that it's very clearly science fiction, is the fact that I'm not framing my work around Christianity. Christianity is not the core of the tension here. I, as a result, needed to create my own cultural canon, and I did, and we'll talk about that in another episode. I have a whole work that a lot of people draw upon, stories that are seeded throughout this text, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The Sunmaster's Journey is what it's called. And with that framework, and with the framework of this partnership, this massive intergalactic compact between species, I tell the story of essentially 4 quote-unquote children of Doro. Doro this time is not a tyrant father, it's a tyrant planet. And the children, quote-unquote, are all citizens of that planet. So they hold different points of view, they have different ways of being, different ways of seeing, and the first half of my piece, just like the first half of Brothers Karamazov, explores those different points of view and tension. The second half then moves on to exploring what happens when the planet explodes. And I actually do blow up the planet. More on that later. The benefit of sci-fi, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next piece, is that it makes polyphonic narration really easy. Really easy. Because for Dostoevsky, he was creating a third person, an omniscient narrator who's also present. And with sci-fi, thanks to the whole idea of artificial intelligence, it's easy to do the same. So I have, for my narrator, a ship that is captained by one of the children of Doro. And that ship has access to records from everywhere, from before the world was destroyed. There were times when that ship's computer needed to download or review documents, so they have access to a lot of those interior records, personal journals, and they also exist. They also have an actual concrete existence. So, oh my goodness, Dostoevsky would have had a field day, I think, with science fiction. Which is not to say that there wasn't science fiction. Last component here, we'll get back to this in later components or episodes. Dostoevsky was writing at a time before science fiction as a commercial genre existed. That did not mean that there wasn't speculative fiction. There was absolute speculative fiction. But the Western construct, the commercial sci-fi that we know started in the 1920s with a whole bunch of magazines and short stories with very strong, very North American-oriented preoccupations, that has changed our understanding of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction has always been with us. Always. And even Dostoevsky has a short story, very common to his era. There was a lot of integration of religious belief and science fiction in that period. And one common theme that came up in quite a few writings of the period was imagining other worlds. Because at that time, people understood, okay, wait, the universe is a lot bigger than we had thought, and it's a lot older than we had thought. So obviously, if there's a God, it must all be like the playing field for the God. They must be doing other experiments, other things are going on in other parts of the cosmos. One very common imagining would be floating through space or drifting through space, maybe being guided by an angel. This came back to German Romanticism. There are a lot of these kinds of dream sequences of moving through the darkness and being awed by the glory of God made manifest in the depths of the cosmos. And Dostoevsky, probably in a very low period of his own life too, we'll talk about that in other episodes, imagined going through the cosmos and being granted a planet that they could create and build a species on and go through all of the steps leading up to the creation of Christ and the persecution of Christ and the question of loving one's creation after seeing the people on that planet murder your beloved son that you've sent down. So science fiction, long before 1920s, was an active mode. We'll maybe also use speculative fiction only because science fiction is so loaded in that particular way. But those questions about how we live in the cosmos have been so entangled and enmeshed in our notion of philosophy. So I don't feel like I am doing anything particularly unusual in that regard with this piece. I am doing something that we don't often see today because the way that science fiction as a genre has moved has often been to create very rigid lines in the sand. And there is lots of philosophical sci-fi. We will get into it. But it's also not often what we first associate with sci-fi. So I have a very distinctly sci-fi piece. It has alien species. It takes place on a distant planet before the planet It's destroyed. It's in a nebulous far future with a completely different cultural context, and yet it is, I believe, a strong playing field, a good playing field for thinking about questions near and dear to all of us, which is what all sci-fi does. It always comments on the present. So in the next few episodes, I will talk more about that. But May 4, you'll be able to get a copy in paperback and in ebook format. It's available on Amazon Kindle, the Kindle Select program, for the first 90 days. I'm debating a hardcover. I might also put up a hardcover possibility for this because some people really love those. But the other ones will all be available on May 4th for sure. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you again for following along. And we will be doing a lot more of these, and I'll hopefully be keeping them a lot shorter, punchier. But I just wanted to get back into the rhythm because March was such a month of catch-up. So thank you so very much for listening, following along, and I look forward to any feedback you might have on this whole journey that I've talked about, your own experiences with philosophical sci-fi, with 19th century literature, anything. It's all good. Conversations with literature are really something we need to bring back again. Hopefully this helps. Thanks all.